Welcome to this new automotive news video, Tuesday, May 5, 2026, and today we're going to talk about Renault again. Starting with some good news, since Renault has just launched a new version of the Clio 6 with an ultra-economical new internal combustion engine, for which there is no CO2 penalty to pay. However, there's some less encouraging news for the Renault 5 and its batteries, which we'll cover in this video. We'll also discuss Peugeot preparing to launch two high-end luxury models, but also about the new Kia XCeed, which is getting a complete facelift. And finally, we'll talk about the April 2026 figures for the French automotive fleet market, a struggling market that will seriously impact the used car market. I hope these topics will interest you. If that's the case, I count on you to show it as usual by leaving a like, subscribing for upcoming videos, boosting this one if the option appears for you, and leaving a comment where you share your opinion on today's news, especially regarding the Clio 6. Would you be tempted by this new version of the Clio 6 with a small, ultra-economical engine and no penalty? And that's actually going to be the first topic of this video. We're going to talk about Renault, which keeps rolling out new versions of the Clio 6. By the way, just a quick note, the Clio 6 has finally dethroned the Clio 5 on the French market. You should know that until now, the Clio 5, which was already 7 years old, was still selling better in 2026 than the Clio 6, which had just arrived on the market. But now the trend has reversed since April 2026, with the Clio 6 climbing to 4th place among the best-selling cars in France, with 17,000 units registered. The Clio 5 dropped to 5th place with 14,000 units, which means that technically, if you add the sales of the Clio 6 and the Clio 5, the Clio is the best-selling car in France. And this is likely to continue since Renault has just launched a new, even more economical engine on its Clio 6, a fully internal combustion powertrain with no hybrid system, and most importantly, without any penalty. Because yes, there are still 100% combustion cars without penalties, even though they're becoming really rare. This new version will have two new features. The first one is obviously the engine, since this model will feature the 1.2-liter turbocharged engine called Eco-G, which has been used in some Dacia models for a few months now. This engine has a special feature as it was designed to operate with dual fuel with two tanks, one for gasoline and one for LPG, so you can literally drive using either fuel depending on what's available at your station. In this configuration, it produces 120 horsepower, and thanks to these two tanks, one with 50 liters for LPG and one with 39 liters for gasoline.
Renault affiche une autonomie totale de
1,450 kilometers, so the range for combustion engine cars isn't really a big deal, since you don't really have to wait at the pump. The main selling points are elsewhere. The first one is running costs, because even though the combined fuel consumption announced by Renault in 100% LPG mode is 6.5 liters per 100 kilometers, that's 1 liter more per 100 kilometers. That's about 20% more than if you drive on unleaded, yes, but with a fuel that's twice as cheap, since a liter of LPG. Currently, on average, it's at €1 per liter, compared to about €2 for unleaded, which should result in driving savings of about 60%. Still, the second advantage is the price of this new version, €21,900, so it's still a pretty hefty sum. We agree it's a small car, but compared to the rest of the market, it's not that unreasonable. And above all, this car is still €3,000 cheaper than the full hybrid version. E-Tech 160 horsepower, which is the only other version of the Clio 6 that doesn't get a CO2 emissions penalty. So, €21,900 for the entry-level version, €25,900 for the Techno trim with more equipment, and €28,100 for the Esprit Alpine version. The other new feature. The thing is, this LPG version is currently only available with an automatic transmission, the 6-speed EDC gearbox. This is a real innovation for the Renault brand, since the previous Clio with the LPG version was only available with a manual gearbox. So for now, it's only sold with an automatic transmission. There are rumors, though, that Renault is working on a manual version, which would probably be around €2,000 cheaper. That still needs to be confirmed, but it would give a starting price for the LPG version of €19,900. And at that price, it would simply become the cheapest version of the Clio 6. There is still a small drawback with this Renault Clio 6, which is that it has two tanks. So it takes up a bit more space for fuel storage, and the storage space in the trunk is reduced by a few dozen liters, with a trunk that has a total capacity of 260 liters, compared to 309 for the 160 hybrid version I mentioned earlier, and 391 for the regular gasoline version, which doesn't have to deal with a second tank for LPG, nor with a battery. And to conclude on this topic, Renault is also offering financing as a long-term lease, which I don't recommend to avoid falling into the long-term lease trap, but for your information, Renault is advertising a rate of €220 per month over 37 months, with an initial payment of €2,500. There you go. It might interest you if you're a professional, probably a bit less if you're a private individual. On the Kia side, they've just revealed the new XCeed, which has been given a facelift to bring it a bit more up to date. There are quite a few aesthetic updates, since Kia is applying the style they've called Opposites United across their entire range. So that gives us a completely new look, a new much slimmer grille, and a new very thin LED headlight profile, similar to what most other brands are doing with modern cars. At the rear as well, we see something that's very trendy among manufacturers: a large light strip that connects the two taillights. Inside, we'll get even larger screens, moving from two 8 and 10-inch screens to two 12.3-inch screens, both housed under a single panel. This creates the impression of a large Mercedes-like screen. The steering wheel is fully redesigned. We've switched from a classic 3-spoke to a chunky 2-spoke style, creating more space for new physical buttons on the sides. Because indeed Kia, like many other brands, is starting to abandon some of its touch features to go back to physical plastic buttons. As for the engine, not all the details have been given to the press yet. What we know is that Kia is currently talking about gasoline engines and mild hybrid engines. It's likely we'll see the non-hybrid 1-liter 3-cylinder turbo gasoline engine under the hood. Also, there will be a 115 horsepower mild hybrid version, as well as a more powerful version with around 140 horsepower. These three engines were either available under the hood of the previous XCeed or found in other Kia models that have arrived in the meantime. The entry-level price shouldn't change much, meaning it will be around 30,000 euros. So it's not exactly cheap, but once again, compared to what's available these days, it's not that unreasonable. Let's remember that it's still 6,000 euros more than when the Kia XCeed was launched in 2019. Even though it's been updated since then, it's still based on the same technological platforms. So it's not just the Korean brands that are aiming for a more upscale image, because Peugeot also wants to relaunch itself into the premium market, or even venture into the luxury segment. Remember, just a few days ago, we talked about how at the Beijing Motor Show, Peugeot unveiled two concept cars: a large shooting brake and a big SUV that's even larger than the 5008. Peugeot directly communicated that these concept cars were not just concept cars. Models that were going to be released, namely the Peugeot 608, which will be this famous shooting brake, and which does look a bit like the previous generation 508, but even bigger, more futuristic, and probably even more high-end. Anyway, as for the price, we'll have to see about the engines and materials, of course, but it's not the only one confirmed, since Peugeot also confirmed that the big SUV we saw in Beijing would be launched as the 8008. It's a big SUV that Peugeot also wants to define as high-end. For now, there isn't a lot of information about them. This 8008 and this 608 will apparently only be available for the Chinese market, and in the end, it would only have the Peugeot name and design, since it would be based on technologies coming from Dongfeng, a Chinese brand that apparently provides the platforms and engines. Would we really want to buy a Peugeot with a PureTech engine in China? I'm not so sure. On the other hand, it does seem to confirm that there is indeed a partnership being created between Stellantis in China and the Dongfeng brand. We've been hearing about it for a few weeks now, and with this kind of news, it seems to be getting confirmed. What is also being confirmed is that April 2026 was a pretty dreadful month for the French corporate fleet car market. Even though the overall market, including private buyers, was only down by 1.6% less dramatic than the other months we've seen since the beginning of the year. But corporate fleets are a different story. A drop of 0.7% was recorded. When you add up the first 4 months of the year, that's an average decrease of 0.9%. We're getting close to a double-digit drop for 2026, a drop whose consequences we don't fully understand yet. But it should result in 2, 3, 4, or 5 years in a worsening shortage of recent cars on the used car market. Usually companies buy a lot of cars. They keep them for 2 or 3 years and then they renew their fleets. This allows a lot of relatively recent cars to be released onto the used car market. Now, we have companies that are either renewing contracts for longer periods, or companies that simply don't buy new vehicles at all. And sooner or later, that's going to become a problem. By the way, speaking of problems, we started this video with Renault. We're going to finish with Renault. The brand announced in March that the Renault 5 electric cars equipped with the 52 kWh battery could benefit from an enhanced EV purchase bonus. So it's kind of a bonus on top of the bonus. That was supposed to be the case because at the time Renault thought that all these 52 kWh batteries used in these Renault 5 EVs were made in France. That's the necessary condition to get this double bonus when buying the electric car. Except that we've ended up being a little behind schedule at the Douai Gigafactory where they're made. As a result, there are still some Renault 5 electric cars with 52 kilowatt batteries being sold, with Chinese batteries. That's why, for now, despite what Renault announced, it's still not possible to take advantage of the extra EV purchase bonus on this model. So you'll have to settle for a 3,500 euro bonus instead of about 7,000 at best. And that's going to last for a few more weeks until battery production in France is sufficient to support production of all 52 Peugeot Renault 5s. That's it for today's news. I hope you found the video interesting. If that's the case, I'm counting on you to show it by leaving a like, subscribing, and supporting the channel by clicking the join button. I'll see you tomorrow for the next news video. Bye.